It began as so many forgotten mysteries do, with something utterly ordinary. Just a happy family photo. But the child's location revealed an unexpected secret. The photo had arrived at the Philadelphia Historical Society in a worn leather pouch brought by an old woman cleaning out her grandmother's attic. Amid dozens of innocuous papers, faded receipts, and fragments of the past, there was only one photo that made people stop. Not because it was special, but because it was so ordinary. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a researcher specializing in African American history after the Civil War, only glanced at it at first. A family portrait taken in 1868 solemn quiet, following all the rigid rules of Victorian photography. She had seen hundreds of them. But then, something slowed her down. The family was a family of 5. The father broad-shouldered in a dark suit, resting his hand on the shoulders of his wife, who wore an elegant dress with a delicate lace collar. The 3 children stood in front, dressed as if it were Sunday. The backdrop was typical of Philadelphia studios of the time, hand-painted columns, heavy curtains, and a false elegance to enhance the solemnity of the subjects. Sarah brought the magnifying glass closer so that the light spread evenly across their faces. The father wore a look of quiet pride. The mother, though not allowed to smile, radiated warmth. The 2 older children, a boy and a girl, maybe 10 and 8, looked directly into the lens, their eyes wide with the solemnity of the time. But the youngest, a boy of about 6, was different. His eyes were not directed at the camera. He looked to the right out of the frame with an expression Sarah couldn't quite place. Not fear, not exactly curiosity, but it was like he knew something. Something adults weren't ready to face. Strange, she whispered in the empty storage room. She turned the desk lamp, letting the light slide gently across the surface of the photograph. The image was strangely preserved, almost undamaged. In the bottom corner, the text was almost faded. Whitman and Sons, Photography, Race Street, Philadelphia. She made a note to study it later. Then she turned back to the boy. Why on such an expensive shoot, when families had to save for months, was he looking away? Parents in those days always told children to stand up straight, hold their breath, look in the right direction. Every detail was important. And what was this child looking at? Sarah moved the magnifying glass slowly. The backdrop depicted classical architecture, faux marble, artificial luxury. And then behind the family, partially obscured by the stage curtain, something caught the light. Strangely, a mirror. Sarah held her breath. 1860s photography sometimes used mirrors to create depth. But the reflection in this mirror seemed accidental, as if it had never been there. A faint, silvery blur reflecting the shape of someone who wasn't in the main frame. Her hand shook slightly as she reached for the scanner. This photograph was hiding something, and that child, with her gaze averted from the lens, was perhaps the only one small enough, innocent enough, to dare look the truth in the face. The next morning, Sarah looked up the donor's file. The old woman's name was Dorothy Peterson and her phone number. After 3 rings, a warm but tired voice answered. Mrs. Peterson, this is Dr. Mitchell from the Historical Society. I am calling about the documents you gave me. Oh yes, my grandmother's stuff. I am not sure if it's useful. Just random papers. Oh, there's a photo I want to ask about. A family portrait taken in 1868. Do you know who they are? A pause. Then a soft sigh. That's my great-great-grandfather. The Williams family. Thomas and Martha Williams with their children. Thomas Jr., Clara, and little Samuel. Sarah jotted down. Samuel, the youngest. Yes, that's right. Samuel was my great-great-grandfather. He lived to be 93 sharp to the end. He told wonderful stories about old Philadelphia. Mrs. Peterson, can you see me? I have a few questions, and I think this photo might hold something of historical importance. This time, the silence was longer. When Dorothy spoke again, her voice was low, wary, cautious. Did you find something? I can't say for sure. But I believe your great-grandfather may have witnessed something important. Something that someone else tried to hide. The silence lingered long enough for Sarah to notice the faint hum of traffic through the receiver, and somewhere behind it, the soft murmur of a television. Then Dorothy finally spoke. He told me once, she said, her voice thin drifting, that the photograph was taken on the most dangerous day of his life. Sarah felt a slow tightening in her chest. Dorothy continued. I was young then. Maybe 10. I thought he was just being dramatic. Old folks tell big stories, you know. But he wasn't joking. He said that picture proved his family were heroes, even though no one could ever know it. Sarah's pulse quickened, her fingers curling around the phone. Did he ever explain what he meant? No. Dorothy breathed. He died 2 weeks later. I never got to ask. Her voice cracked gently like a door hinge touched by time. I've wondered about it my whole life. That photograph sat in my grandmother's drawer for 70 years, then in mine for another 30. I brought it to you because, well, I hoped someone could finally understand. They arranged to meet the next afternoon. Sarah spent the rest of the day buried in records, census entries, city directories, property files, piecing together the shape of a family long gone. Thomas Williams, blacksmith shop on South Street. Martha Williams, seamstress. Homeowners, a rarity for a black family, in 1868, barely 3 years after the Civil War's end. The children appeared in school records. Thomas Jr. and Clara attended the Institute for Colored Youth, one of the few schools offering real education to black children. Samuel, at 6, was likely still home, but it was a sliver of old newsprint from July 1868 that made Sarah's hand go still above the archive table. Local Negro family questioned in suspected harboring case. No charges filed. The article was short, carelessly dismissive, wrapped in the quiet brutality of the era's language. Authorities had investigated the Williams household after unnamed reports of suspicious activity. They found nothing. The case was dropped. Harboring. In 1868, the 13th Amendment had ended slavery. The war was over. Freedom was the law. But Sarah knew what many preferred to forget. The Underground Railroad hadn't vanished. It couldn't. Because in the South, where rural isolation, violence, and corrupt officials formed a dark shelter, slavery still clung on in hidden pockets. Illegal, secret, and horrifyingly real. The networks that once guided enslaved people northward continued their silent work. They still smuggled families toward true safety, often all the way to Canada, out of reach of American law. And the Williams family? Yes. Sarah felt a cold certainty settle in her bones. They had been part of that network, and somehow, against every instinct of secrecy, they had documented a fragment of it in a photograph. The next morning, Sarah stood on Ray Street in Philadelphia's historic district, staring up at the building that had once housed Whitman and Sons Photography. Now it was a cafe, exposed brick, warm bulbs. Industrial chic, but the skeleton of the studio remained tall windows for natural light, high ceilings, once draped in painted backdrops. Inside, she ordered a coffee and asked the barista about the building's past. "It's been like 6 different things," he said, barely invested. "But yeah, it was a photo studio. There's some old stuff in the basement. Owner kept it, 'cause of preservation rules." $20 and a disarming smile later, Sarah pushed open the basement door. The space was cramped, thick with dust, cluttered with restaurant storage. But in the farthest corner, behind tottering stacks of chairs, she saw them. 3 wooden crates marked in faded ink. "Whitman Archives, handled with care." Her breath wavered as she pried open the first crate. Inside were glass plate negatives, hundreds of them, wrapped in brittle newspaper that dissolved at her touch. Portraits of stiff families, stern businessmen, elaborately dressed children. The frozen memories of Philadelphia's 19th century middle class. The second crate held ledgers, neat and yellowed, recording every client, every session, every penny paid. Sarah turned fragile pages slowly, searching for a date, a name. July. Williams. There, written in elegant looping script, were the details: July 23rd, 1868. Williams family, Thomas Martha children. Full portrait sitting, payment $4.50. Special arrangement, evening session. An evening session. Sarah whispered the words aloud, letting them settle into the quiet room. That was unusual. Studios relied on sunlight. Those tall windows weren't decoration, they were the only source of illumination early photography could depend on. Portraits were booked in the bright, reliable hours of day. So why would the Williams family require a session after sunset? Her thoughts began to churn, slow but urgent. Evening meant darkness. Darkness meant empty streets, and empty streets meant privacy. She dove deeper into the ledger, turning pages with growing care. Most entries were ordinary names, dates, payments. But here and there, perhaps once or twice a month, she spotted other evening sessions, each stamped with the same cryptic note, special arrangement, and every one of the surnames belonged to African American families she recognized from her research. Her coffee cooled completely as she cross-referenced each name. The Patterson family, yes. The father listed as a conductor in abolitionist society records. The Morris family searched twice by authorities for contraband in the years after the war. The Hughes family, the mother testified in a freedom suit, helping prove a woman had been held illegally in Maryland. These weren't random portraits. This was a system, a pattern. A carefully crafted archive of the people who continued Philadelphia's quiet, dangerous extension of the Underground Railroad. But why? Why risk putting forbidden actions into permanent form? Why leave evidence behind? Sarah leaned back, the truth rising like something slowly surfacing through deep water. Because photographs were proof. In a world that denied black testimony, dismissed black stories, questioned black humanity, a photograph was undeniable. It showed existence, respectability, property, family, rights. If the authorities ever accused them, dragged them into court, tried to undermine their voices, they would have a shield. A portrait that said, "We are not criminals. We are citizens." But there was something else too. Something hidden, waiting, breathing in the space just beyond the visible. She went back to the Williams entry and noticed a faint scribble in the margin, almost invisible, unless one already suspected something. REM, usual precautions, RM. She flipped to other entries. Yes, there it was again, scattered through the months like quiet footsteps. Robert Mitchell, Richard Moore. Names of known abolitionist allies. Then she found it 5 pages later in different handwriting, likely an assistant's scrawl. RM departed successfully via back entrance. Package secured. Package. The word struck her like a cold draft. The era's cruel shorthand for a person fleeing slavery. Back at the Historical Society, Sarah laid the Williams photograph beneath her highest resolution scanner. Digital tools could peer into shadows the human eye had never truly seen. She zoomed in on the sliver of mirror behind the draped backdrop. At 400% it was vague. At 800% shapes began to form. At 1200% her breath caught completely. There was someone there. A person standing where no one should have been, far off to the side, behind the photographer hiding in the dim. Not the photographer. The angle made that impossible. This figure stood in shadow, half swallowed by the curtain's edge. Dark clothing, a hint of a face, hands clasped tightly to the chest, a posture trembling with fear, or hope, or both. Sarah adjusted. Contrast brightened cautiously, always careful not to invent what wasn't there. Slowly, as if rising through fog, the figure sharpened. A woman. Sarah was nearly sure of it. Young 20, maybe 25. Her dress, simple, coarse, stripped of ornament. Not the refined lace of Martha Williams. This was the clothing of someone with little money, fewer choices, and no safety. Even blurred, even half reflected, her expression radiated something unmistakable. Desperate hope. Sarah sat back, heart unsteady, assembling the truth piece by piece. The Williams family had come to the studio at night when no customers would be present, when the street outside lay in darkness, when the back entrance could open without witness. They had brought their children, dressed in their finest, purchased an expensive portrait that proclaimed their dignity. And while they did so, hidden just behind them, stood someone who could not be recorded, someone who could not risk her face in the open, someone who needed to stay in shadow while the family created their alibi. Little Samuel, only 6 years old, hadn't been inattentive. He hadn't misbehaved. He had been looking at her, at the woman his family was protecting, at the human life depending on their silence. Within hours, she would likely be moved further along the secret network toward true freedom. Samuel, in his innocent honesty, could not stop himself. He simply looked at the most important person in the room. Sarah pulled up the newspaper clipping again. The investigation into the Williams family had happened in July 1868. The photograph was created on July 23rd, 1868. That timing was no coincidence at all. The Williams family had been investigated, questioned, their home searched room by room, every drawer opened as if truth itself might be hiding inside. And so within days they created a portrait, calm, polished, almost overly proper. A photograph meant to whisper, "See, we are respectable. We are safe. We are exactly the kind of people who would never break the law." Except the photograph was both an alibi and quietly in its reflection, a confession. There was something else too. Something Sarah noticed only when she leaned closer. She zoomed in on little Samuel's face, studying his expression with the care of someone listening for a secret. That wasn't a child drifting off in boredom. No, his eyes were sharp-focused, purposeful, and there at the corner of his mouth, a shadow of something not quite a smile, almost as if he knew, as if he understood that this moment mattered. A tiny spark of complicity, a hint of a child carrying a burden far heavier than his age. He was looking at the woman in the mirror, deliberately holding himself still so the camera wouldn't betray him, watching her to make sure she was safe, keeping quiet watch while the shutter clicked. This little boy had been a lookout. Days later, Dorothy Peterson walked into the Historical Society carrying a worn cloth bag that looked older than she was. At 78, her silver hair-framed eyes sharp enough to study Sarah before she even sat down. "Show me what you found," she said softly, without introduction. Sarah laid out the enhanced images, the original photograph, the magnified mirror, the studio ledger, the newspaper clipping from the investigation. Dorothy's hand lifted to her mouth. "Oh my God." "She was really there." "You knew?" Sarah asked, her voice gentle. "I thought it was just a story," Dorothy whispered. "Something my great-grandfather said when he was old. When I wasn't sure, he still remembered things clearly." Her fingers trembled as they touched the photograph. "He told me they helped people, that before he started school, his house was a stop on the railroad. But that was before the war. I thought he was confused. The timing made no sense." Sarah shook her head. "It does. The railroad didn't just stop. It couldn't. In the deeper South, people were still being held illegally. The network continued, but quieter, darker. Because now it wasn't risky, it was outright criminal. And if your family was caught," Dorothy finished for her nodding. "Prison, ruined reputation, everything gone." She drew a shaky breath. "He told me. He remembered a woman. Just one. She stayed in their attic for 3 days. He sneaked food up to her. And once, she sang to him. Just a few quiet notes. A song he never forgot. She hummed it now, an old spiritual soft and trembling, full of sorrow and hope, woven together. He was only 6, she continued. But he knew it was dangerous. He said helping her was the most important thing his family ever did." Sarah reached into her folder and pulled out another document. "I think I found her a ship manifest from Philadelphia to Nova Scotia, July 1868. A woman listed only as RM. Same initials as in the studio ledger. No age, no origin. Just the notation passage paid by private charity." Dorothy's voice shrank to a whisper. "Did she make it?" "The ship arrived safely," Sarah said. "After that, She disappears. No records, no trail, which likely means she succeeded. She got to live her life. Free. They sat together in stillness, looking at the photograph. The family posed proudly, hiding their courage in plain sight. The woman's reflection, barely visible unless you knew exactly where to look. This was taken right after the investigation, Sarah said softly. Your family was sending a message. Look at us. Respectable, educated, proper. But they had already broken the law. They'd just finished breaking it. And somehow, they hid the evidence right there in the mirror. Dorothy smiled through her tears. That sounds like him. He always said the bravest people look ordinary. They do extraordinary things and then go back to their lives like nothing happened. From her cloth bag, Dorothy pulled out an old cracked leather journal. This was Samuel's, she said. He wrote in it during the 1920s and 30s. I haven't opened it in years. But maybe it holds something you can use. Sarah accepted it reverently. On the first page in careful handwriting, Samuel had written, "For my grandchildren, so they know what their family stood for." That night, Sarah read the journal by lamplight, afraid to expose the fragile pages to harsh fluorescent bulbs. Samuel's handwriting was elegant, practiced, the script of someone educated, thoughtful. Most entries were simple dinners, business notes, church meetings. But scattered among them were passages that made Sarah's breath stop. August 12th, 1923. 55 years since the photograph. I remember her face, terrified and brave in equal measure. Mother later told me she walked 90 miles to reach Philadelphia. 3 days in our attic. I brought her bread and water pretending I was a soldier on a secret mission. She thanked me, called me her little guardian. I knew we were hiding her from danger, though not how much danger. And I knew if I told a soul, our family would be destroyed. Sarah turned the fragile pages. November 3rd, 1931. A young historian visited today asking about the railroad. I gave him the usual answers, that heroism fades into shadows, that details are lost. I didn't mention the photograph, or R.M. Rachel Martin, though I didn't learn her full name until she wrote to Mother from Toronto in 1889. Reading her letter, knowing she had built a life in freedom, I cried like a child. Mother kept the letter. I pray my daughter keeps it too. Someday, when the truth won't hurt anyone, I hope someone finds it. Rachel Martin. A full name to attach to the reflection that had haunted the mirror for more than a century. Sarah continued reading. July 23rd, 1935. 67 years ago today, we took that photograph. I am the last living person who stood in that room. Thomas Jr. died in 1918. Clara in 1929. Mother and father long gone. Mr. Whitman, the photographer's son, died last year. At his funeral, his grandson asked if I knew him. I said only as a customer. But the truth is, he was as brave as any of us. He opened his studio after dark. He turned away when families slipped someone in through the back door. I wonder if he knew the mirror caught her, if he left it intentionally, a secret witness for the future. I like to think he did. The final relevant entry was written just weeks before Samuel died in 1961. I told my great-granddaughter Dorothy about the photograph today. She's 10, bright as summer. She asked why we looked so serious. I told her it wasn't seriousness, it was bravery, that the photograph was taken on the most dangerous day of my life. that it proved my family were heroes even if no one could ever know. I hope someday someone sees. I hope the mirror tells its story. Sarah closed the journal with trembling hands. Samuel had hoped someone would understand. And 157 years later, someone finally had. But finding Rachel Martin herself was harder. The ship Manifest confirmed her travel to Nova Scotia. But Canadian records in the 1860s were thin, incomplete, especially for black refugees who used new names or vanished into communities that protected them from American pursuers, even across borders. Sarah contacted archives across Toronto, Halifax, Montreal. She posted in historical forums. She reached out to genealogists specializing in African Canadian history, and the search began. 3 weeks later, an email arrived in Sarah's inbox, quiet, unassuming, yet carrying the weight of a century and a half. It was from Dr. James Robinson, a retired professor in Toronto who had devoted 40 years to studying black Canadian settlements in the fragile years after the Civil War. "I think I found your Rachel Martin," his message began, though in Canada she went by Rachel Morrison, a common practice changing surnames for safety. He continued, "Census records show a Rachel Morrison arriving in Toronto in August 1868, approximately 24 years old, listed as coming from Pennsylvania. She married in 1871 to a carpenter named Frederick Morrison, 4 children. She died in 1921 at the age of 77 and is buried in Toronto's Necropolis Cemetery." Attached were scanned documents, fragile windows into a life rebuilt, a marriage certificate, birth records for the children, a death certificate, and one more item, a yellowing newspaper clipping from the Toronto Globe dated 1919. The image was grainy, but Sarah could see her an elderly woman with soft, wise eyes and white hair, surrounded by fellow church members. The caption read, "Mrs. Rachel Morrison, beloved member of First Baptist Church, honored for 50 years of service assisting new arrivals to Canada, helping families transition to freedom. She had spent her life giving others the very thing she had once fled toward, freedom." Sarah sat back, stunned. The ghostly reflection in the mirror, the faint, almost invisible figure had lived, had married, had raised children, had carved a place in a new land. The courage that carried her north had become a lifetime of guiding others. But Dr. Robinson's email wasn't finished. One of Rachel Morrison's great-granddaughters still lives in Toronto. Patricia Morrison Chen, retired school teacher. "I mentioned your work to her, hope you don't mind. She is very interested in speaking with you." Patricia's email address waited at the bottom, like a small door opening into another story. Sarah wrote immediately. They scheduled a video call for the next evening. Patricia appeared on screen with silver braids and the same gentle eyes as the woman in the 1919 photograph. "Tell me everything," she said, without hesitation. "My great-grandmother never spoke of her escape, only told my grandmother that angels in Philadelphia saved her life. She promised never to reveal their names." Sarah shared everything: the photograph, the enhanced mirror reflection, the entries from Samuel's journal, the story of the Williams family, and the dangerous investigation that nearly destroyed them. Patricia wept openly. She kept her promise, she whispered. She never spoke the name Williams. Even when she was dying, even when my grandmother begged for details, She said it was still too dangerous, that those families might suffer even generations later. Patricia wiped her eyes, then paused, but she wrote something. Wait. She disappeared off screen and returned with a small wooden box worn smooth with age. This holds her things, letters, papers, little pieces of her life. From it, she removed a folded slip of paper, its edges fragile as dry leaves. This was pinned inside her Bible. We found it after she died. None of us knew what it meant. She held it up to the camera. In faint, elegant handwriting were 4 lines. July 23rd, 1868. The day I became free. Thanks to the blacksmith's family and the little boy who watched over me. Sarah's vision blurred. That little boy was Samuel, she whispered. 6 years old. He brought her food. He stood guard for her. She remembered him all her life, and now we know his name. Patricia replied softly. After all these years, we can finally say thank you. With Rachel's identity confirmed, and with Patricia's blessing to tell her story, Sarah returned to the Whitman studio ledgers with renewed purpose. If the Williams family and Rachel Martin represented one successful passage, how many others were hidden in those cryptic evening sessions? For 2 months, she worked tirelessly, cross-referencing names, dates, census entries, and archived articles. Slowly, a pattern emerged, quiet, methodical, unmistakable. Approximately twice a month between 1866 and 1872, Whitman and Sons Photography conducted special arrangement evening sessions for black families. The ledgers hid truths in plain sight. Package, secured, departure, confirmed, safe arrival, noted, coded language for survival. Sarah uncovered 17 families in total. 17 households intertwined in the secret network. The Pattersons, who ran a boarding house offering temporary refuge. The Hughes family wagon makers, whose carts carried people hidden in false bottoms. The Morris family connected deeply to the Black Church network, guiding frightened new arrivals to safety. Every family had taken enormous risks. Every family had been investigated at least once. And every family had commissioned portraits, quiet shields crafted to prove respectability, stability, innocence. The photographs were more than memories. They were armor. Look at us, they seemed to say. We are homeowners, business owners, educated, respectable. Would people like us commit crimes? But as Sarah discovered through abolitionist society records, there was still another layer waiting beneath the surface. The truth about photographer James Whitman Jr. was far more complicated than anyone had ever imagined. He wasn't simply looking the other way. He was part of the shadowed world itself. His father, James Whitman Sr., had once been a devoted abolitionist, using his quiet studio to create solemn portraits of formerly enslaved people, images that proved their humanity and strengthened legal claims to freedom. When the elder Whitman died in 1865, his son inherited not only the studio, but the hidden mission woven into its very walls. And so James Jr. continued the work quietly, carefully, long after the war had supposedly ended the need for it. His studio welcomed ordinary families during the day, but in the evenings, the space transformed. Behind the velvet curtains, beyond the staged backdrops, the building's basement opened to a narrow alleyway. And that alley, well, it connected to something older, something built for fleeing footsteps. Remnants of the Underground Railroad still lingered, a network of hidden passages threading through Philadelphia's aging brick. Under cover of darkness, people who were still trapped in the cruel afterlives of slavery slipped through those passages into Whitman's studio. There they waited in the dim back room while a family posed for an evening portrait, smiling just long enough for the streets outside to empty before they stepped out again into the night, walking toward a freedom that remained illegal but morally undeniable. In the archives, Sarah discovered Whitman's personal journal, a small book, edges softened by time, each entry short but pulsing with urgency. Evening session, Williams family. RM departed safely. Fourth successful passage this month, father would be proud. Another page read, authorities asking questions about evening activities. Increased caution necessary, but the work continues. Then, almost tenderly, portrait of the Hughes family infant included. First baby born free in Canada to a family we assisted. Small victories. James Whitman Jr. died in 1934. His obituary made no mention of the nights he risked everything or the families he quietly saved. Not a single word. He carried the secret to his grave, protecting the people he had helped long after his hands could no longer hold a camera. But the photographs remained, silent, patient, waiting for the right eyes to understand. 6 months after Sarah first uncovered the fragile reflection in the Williams family portrait, she found herself standing in the main gallery of the Philadelphia Historical Society. Before her visitors moved slowly through an exhibition she had spent countless nights shaping. It was titled Hidden in Plain Sight, Philadelphia's Post-War Underground Railroad. 2 rooms filled with shadows, memories, and truths no longer content to hide. At the center hung the Williams family photograph. The original on one side, the enhanced version, revealing Rachel Martin's faint reflection on the other. Around it were 16 more portraits from Whitman's evening sessions, each one accompanied by careful explanations of who the families were, the risks they faced, and the lives reshaped by their courage. Visitors leaned in, close tracing the images with their eyes hunting for their own discoveries. Interactive screens let them zoom into the tiniest corners, places where light slipped, where shadows bent, where clues had waited for generations. Interviews played softly on nearby monitors. Descendants Dorothy Peterson, Patricia Morrison, Chen, and others speaking of ancestors who had once whispered in fear yet walked with bravery. But nothing drew more attention than Samuel Williams's journal. Displayed in a climate-controlled glass case, its pages delicate as breath. It was open to the line he wrote as a child, Rachel's little guardian. People stopped there longest, some with wonder in their eyes, others with sorrow, many with pride. Dorothy and Patricia stood together before the Williams portrait. Meeting for the first time, though connected by an act of courage more than a century old. They had spent the morning sharing stories, laughing between tears. My great-grandfather would have loved this, Dorothy murmured, gesturing to the exhibition. All his life, he hoped someone would understand. And now, thousands will see. Patricia nodded, her gaze fixed on the reflection in the mirrored surface. I'm looking at my great-grandmother's face, she whispered. After all these years, all the wondering, here she is, scared, brave, on the edge of freedom. A little boy no more than 7 walked up to the portrait with his parents. He pointed at young Samuel. "Why is he looking over there instead of at the camera?" His mother read the placard softly. Because he was watching over someone who needed help, someone who was hiding. "He was very brave," the boy stared thoughtfully. "Like a superhero," his father nodded. "Exactly like a superhero, except real." From across the gallery, Sarah watched the family wander from display to display, the boy's curiosity blooming with each question. She felt a warm ache in her chest. This, she thought, is why history matters, not just as dates and names, but as evidence of what people are capable of when courage outweighs fear. The exhibition would soon travel first to Toronto, then Washington, then across cities where similar networks had once lived in the quiet spaces beneath ordinary life. Rachel Martin's story, the Williams family's bravery, Whitman's hidden work, all of it would be preserved, studied, honored. That evening, after the gallery emptied, Sarah stood alone before the Williams portrait. She thought of Samuel, only 6, holding a secret that could have destroyed his family. She thought of Rachel walking 90 miles toward hope, trusting strangers in the night. She thought of Thomas and Martha Williams opening their home despite the dangers. She thought of James Whitman using his art not only to document humanity, but to shield it. And then she thought about the photograph itself. A simple family portrait, taken in a moment of fear and courage intertwined. It had guarded its secret for 157 years, whispering only to those willing to look closely. A truth hidden in a reflection. Courage preserved in silver and light. A legacy finally understood. 3 years after the exhibition opened, an unexpected email arrived in Sarah's inbox. The subject line glowed softly on Sarah's screen. Simple, but weighted with meaning. "You helped me find my family." The email came from Marcus Williams, a 32-year-old software engineer living in Seattle. He explained that he'd visited the exhibition during its West Coast tour, drawn at first by nothing more than the familiar surname. But curiosity had nudged him further. Genealogical research, old census scans, fragments of family stories, each clue leading him backward through generations, until he reached a name he'd never heard before: Thomas Williams Jr., the older brother of little Samuel in the photograph. "I never knew Marcus wrote. My father always said our roots were in Philadelphia, but he didn't know the details. To learn that my great-great-great-grandfather was part of the Underground Railroad, that my family risked everything to help people. It's changed how I see myself. It's changed what I believe I'm capable of." Sarah felt a slow smile rise as she read his message. This was the impact she had hoped for. Not history frozen behind glass, but history breathing, reaching into the lives of the living, reminding them that courage and justice were not abstract ideals. They were choices made by real people. People whose blood still flowed in the descendants walking the streets today. And Marcus was not the only one. The exhibition had sparked dozens of revelations across North America. Families who had visited out of curiosity soon found themselves digging into records, discovering unexpected truths. Some learned that their ancestors had been helped like Patricia. Others that their ancestors had been helpers like Marcus. Each discovery wove another thread into the widening tapestry. Dorothy Peterson had passed away at 81, her gentle voice falling silent at last. But before she left the world, she recorded an oral history, one that now played softly in a dimly lit room at the end of the exhibition. Her storytelling, warm and steady, carried Samuel's memories into a future he could never have imagined. Meanwhile, Patricia Morrison Chen had written a book, an exploration of Rachel Martin's life in Canada. Using the photograph and Sarah's research as her foundation, she traced the struggles and triumphs of Black refugees building new beginnings in Toronto. The book struck a national chord and soon became required reading in Ontario schools. The Williams family portrait had become iconic. It appeared in textbooks, documentaries, museum halls. But for Sarah, its significance was far more intimate. Its power rested in the quiet reminder that ordinary objects examined closely could reveal extraordinary truths. She built her career around that principle, helping families and researchers peel back layers of forgotten history hidden in old photographs. And yet, none ever matched the Williams portrait. It was the case that taught her to look not only at what was visible, but at what lingered in the margins, in the shadows, in the reflections people never meant to leave behind. On July 23rd, the anniversary of the day she had first noticed Rachel Martin's faint reflection, and exactly 158 years after the photograph had been taken, Sarah returned to Philadelphia. She stood on Ray Street where the Whitman studio had once stood, letting her imagination drift gently backward. She pictured the Williams family walking toward the studio through the warm darkness of an 1868 summer night. Their children, dressed in their very best clothes, their hearts beating fast with a mixture of fear and resolve. She imagined Rachel Martin slipping quietly through the back entrance, waiting in the cool shadows while the family created their alibi. She imagined James Whitman adjusting his lights, arranging the scene with practiced care. And she imagined 6-year-old Samuel doing his best to stand still, just as he'd been taught, yet unable to stop his eyes from drifting toward the person he loved, the person he was trying to protect. That one small, honest glance, unplanned, unguarded, had preserved a truth that might otherwise have been lost forever. Standing there on Ray Street, Sarah wondered how many other truths lay hidden in archives, attics, museums, storerooms, and old family trunks. How many stories waited in the corners of photographs in shadows and half-visible reflections. How many other children like Samuel had captured secrets without realizing it? History, she knew, was not only what people intended to record, it was also what survived by accident, what lingered in the periphery, what patient eyes could uncover when looking where no one else thought to look. She lifted her phone and took a photograph of the building that now stood where the studio once had. In the glass reflection of the cafe window beside her, she saw strangers walking past, talking softly, going about their ordinary lives. And Sarah thought, ordinary people doing ordinary things until the moment comes when they must decide whether to be extraordinary, just like the Williams family, just like Rachel Martin. Just like every soul whose courage captured accidentally or intentionally in silver and light, waits patiently for someone to finally see.